I'm going to start by reading you a passage from David K. Johnson's The Lavenders Scare, the Cold War Persecution of Gays and Lesbians in Federal Government. Now, if you happen to pick up this book in your spare time and you want to read it and check this quote, you can find it on page 157, starting at 157 and ending at page 159. If this subject doesn't interest you, of course, you don't need to pick up this book, but if it does, that's where you'll find this. Quote, for many men and women, once the axe fell, losing a permanent government career was only the beginning of their torment, as the apparatus of the national security state continued to limit their job prospects. The federal government's influence on other industries and institutions was so great that many found their paths blocked at every turn. After being forced out of the Department of Commerce, Madeline Tress won a Fulbright fellowship to study abroad. But the State Department vetoed her award because her government file had been flagged with the note, quote, questionable loyalty and morals, and then parentheses, just the word lesbian. This was the final blow that made her abandon a career in international economics and go into private industry. The whole idea was, I felt shut off, Tress remembered. An unknown number of gay men and lesbians, stripped of their livelihoods, facing embarrassment and unemployment, took their own lives. An official of the General Services Administration told a congressional investigator that one government employee confronted with, quote, charges of perversion had committed suicide by leaping from a bridge. John Montgomery, a 42-year-old bachelor and manager of the Finnish desk at the State Department, committed suicide by hanging himself on the second-floor balcony overlooking the foyer of the Georgetown townhouse he shared with A. Marvin Braverman, a Washington attorney. Though clear documentation of only a handful of suicides exists, the quiet handling of many of the gay interrogations and resignations suggests the possibility of many, many more. Washington newspapers from the period contain numerous stories of single male government workers, often State Department employees, who committed suicide for no known reason. When we think about the Red Scare, a lot of times there is a desire on our part to overlook its human costs. This is partly because it can be so much easier for us to detach ourselves from the injustices of the past and the pained experiences they cause. Sure, we can certainly look at the Red Scare as an abstract concept. We can condemn the fact that thousands of people lost their jobs, their families, and even their lives, all in a wave of political repression designed to uproot a fantastical communist conspiracy. But we tend to do this with a luxury of distance. When we talk about the Red Scare, that distance can be comfortable, but it can also keep us from making the connections necessary to avoid repeats of the Red Scare in the future. But before we get too far into this, let's look at the agenda for today. First, we should talk about how the Red Scare started. Right? Why did we go from 1945 victory in Europe and victory over Japan and all this post-war optimism? How did things change so suddenly? Who was targeted? A name like the Red Scare, you might think that it's just the Reds, right? Just the communists that are being targeted by government purges and investigations. This isn't exactly true. You also see the targeting of people who are described as pink, who are described as security risks, or even just fellow travelers. We'll look at that last category, right? Who or what is a fellow traveler and what makes them dangerous? How does the government handle them? And then, of course, we'll come to an end by examining the outcomes of the Red Scare. What did we gain? What did we lose? And was it all worth it? Before jumping in, though, it's worth refreshing our minds on some topics we talked about in past lectures, as well as spend some time touching on things that we haven't necessarily talked about yet, but are still important for our discussion here, right? Things that are happening that maybe we haven't talked about in class directly, but are going to eventually. As you'll recall, the United States comes out of World War II, not only with the world's largest economy, but also as one of two global superpowers that has a pretty substantial say in world affairs. Many Americans viewed the Soviet Union, the other global superpower, as a hostile totalitarian dictatorship that was bent on spreading communism around the world. Fears of Soviet conquest and domination led the US to abandon pre-war isolationism and take a greater role on the world stage. This leads the US to spend billions of dollars rebuilding Europe to counteract the Soviet threat there. But communism simply expands elsewhere. First, American allies in China are overthrown by communist revolutionaries in 1949, and then many of those same communists fight the United Nations to a standstill in Korea. At the same time, momentous changes were occurring domestically that also gave many more traditional Americans newfound anxieties. The upheaval of World War II prompted scores of women to leave their home and assume jobs in munitions plants, leading to an explosion of feminist thought and even queer identity. The pressing need for labor forced the government to desegregate essential industries as more people of color and civil rights sympathizers joined a rapidly expanding movement. Recall, of course, that during American involvement in World War II, membership in the NAACP increased by almost 1,000%, right? They had about 50,000 members. At the end of the war, they have close to 500,000. And the working class generally afforded expanded rights under FDR's New Deal, were using their union power to shut down the operations of multinational companies. Using mass strikes, sit-ins, sabotage, and other forms of resistance, workers were able to win unprecedented wage and benefit increases. At the same time, massive unions with millions of members set their sight on forcing the government to expand the welfare state through provisions and services like national health care and public housing. So how does the Red Scare start? Well, at the end of the war, we have these Cold War rivalries kind of already putting folks on edge, right? You have the occupation of Germany, you have the installation of Soviet satellite governments in East Europe, a lot of other geopolitical problems, especially in East Asia with the partitioning of post-war land there. These situations were only made worse when the OSS, the precursor organization to today's CIA, they raided the New York offices of a left-leaning foreign policy journal known as Amerasia. In their office files, agents found a trove of classified wartime documents that had been restricted to the public. Some of the staff at Amerasia were suspected of espionage and were ultimately charged with the unauthorized possession of those government documents. And several of Amerasia's writers, it turns out, were actual communists, right? They had membership in the Communist Party. This fact led officials to fear that Soviet spies had tunneled their way into the halls of the federal government. So it's something known as the Amerasia Affair, named after the journal Amerasia. President Truman responded to the Amerasia Affair by instituting new policies that required federal employees to undergo more intensive screenings. Employees who didn't meet the government's high standards were excused for being security risks, and their names were circulated within government as well as with major private industries to prevent them from gaining access to kind of secret or sensitive information going forward. This ultimately wasn't enough for folks who still believed that communists could be hiding out, if not in government, then in other positions of power in American society. After these initial rounds of investigations, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, sometimes just spelled or mentioned phonetically as HUAC, the HUAC began conducting their own investigations of anyone who was perceived to be a potential threat to national security. The HUAC had been formed in 1938 to keep tabs on Americans involved in explicitly fascist or communist organizations, right? If there was a Nazi party in the United States in 1940 and there was, HUAC would be keeping tabs on them, just like the communists. But after the Amerasia Affair and the beginning of the Red Scare, the scope of HUAC's investigations expanded greatly. HUAC hearings, and other security investigations produced mixed results. There are a lot of people who may have constituted security threats in some contexts who were driven out of federal employment, sure, but investigators could point to few actual communists being found out as evidence of their success. Despite the lack of returns, though, by 1950, new developments in world politics and the challenges those developments came with led many Americans to view their country as one which was entirely besieged by communist spies. Not only had Truman famously lost China to Soviet domination, right? In 1949, you have that Chinese Revolution, But the Korean War had just kicked off in 1950. And at the same time, new espionage trials at home led many Americans to question who they could really trust. In 1949, the Soviet Union tests their first atomic bomb. And that leads to probably one of the most well-known espionage trials that takes place in the United States in the 20th century. That trial was the Rosenberg trial. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were two Manhattan-born Americans who had been accused of supplying the Soviet Union with state secrets that ultimately enabled Stalin and the Soviet Union to construct that atomic bomb. Julius was an electrical engineer during the war. He worked on some top secret projects, mostly involving radar and civil air defense systems, right? The idea that you would use electric currents and sonic frequencies to anticipate when planes were coming to a city. At the end of World War II, the Army was made aware that Julius was a member in the Communist Party. Evidence which has been studied since the Rosenberg trial seems to suggest that neither Julius nor his wife Ethel would have had access to the kinds of atomic secrets that would have allowed the Soviets to complete their bomb faster, right? He just wouldn't have had access to that information. Historical debate is still divided on whether or not Julius gave radar-related secrets to the Soviet Union, right? So he didn't have access to the Manhattan Project, how to enrich uranium, but he did have some sensitive information that he could have possibly given to the Soviet Union. So history is divided on that, but the consensus seems to agree that Ethel, his wife, who was a professional actress by trade, would have had no involvement or even knowledge of these kinds of discussions or dealings. International protests were organized to free the Rosenbergs. Many activists called specific attention to the kind of flimsy and circumstantial evidence which was used against them, right? Even decades later, historians are still divided on whether or not Julius was guilty. Regardless of these efforts, though, both Julius and Ethel were tried, convicted, found guilty, and sentenced to death for their role in espionage. Their execution was ultimately carried out on June 19th in 1953 during the height of the Red Scare. This was done by electric chair. While Julius's execution went fairly smoothly, Ethel needed to be electrocuted several times before she eventually died. The couple left behind 2 children, both of whom were minors, and their funeral in New York City was attended by more than 10,000 people. At the same time as the Rosenberg trial, Alger Hiss was a US politician. He's been credited with a lot of things. He's was credited with creating the US State Department. He was credited with helping establish the United Nations, this kind of multinational organization that takes off after World War II. He is accused of being a Soviet spy during the Red Scare. Now, Hiss was put on trial, and after he's initially cleared by a mistrial, he's tried for a second time. He's technically found guilty of perjury, right? The idea that you lie under oath or you willingly falsify information during court proceedings. Not that he was found guilty of espionage, but that he might have misled the court. And he was sentenced to 10 years in prison by a grand jury. Now, Alger Hiss maintained his innocence until his death in 1996. He said, "I never spied for the Soviet Union. The information that I gave was factual, was the truth." In 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia claimed they had no records that suggested Hiss had ever worked for them. But of course, obviously, some refused to believe Hiss, and his career ended with the Alger Hiss trial. Incidents like these emboldened politicians who were confident that a secret plot by communists hidden within the federal government to ultimately overthrow it existed. And they leaned into post-war uncertainties and fears of the day to press even more investigations and purges. At a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, one Wisconsin senator got up in front of a crowd and announced, quote, "In my opinion, the State Department," the one which Alger Hiss founded, "which is one of the most important government departments, is thoroughly infested with communists. I have in my hand 57 cases of individuals who would appear to be either card-carrying members or certainly loyal to the Communist Party, but who nevertheless are still helping to shape our foreign policy. That man was Joseph McCarthy. And I should probably mention that he never actually shared that list that he had with other people. The number on the list always seemed to change too. One day it might be 78, another day it might be 205, and another day yet it might be over 400. What was constant was the message that there were communists, not just in government, but all throughout American society, and that they needed to be cleared out. In the ensuing panic that McCarthy essentially helps promote and spearhead, but he didn't start it, certainly, right? By the time he gives this speech, the Red Scare is well underway. But in the ensuing panic, greater and greater numbers of people begin to call on the HUAC to expand their hearings and make sure that the secret communists in society are uncovered and that they're dealt with. As the Red Scare became demonstrably harsher, public officials, activists, and others are brought before courts and harangued into confessing previous loyalties to the Communist Party, whether they existed or not, and are coerced into naming names. So who does the Red Scare target? Now, we should spend a little bit of time here talking about who the Red Scare targets, right? But first, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that this Red Scare, the one that occurs in the 40s and 50s, is actually known as the Second Red Scare. This is because there are actually multiple Red Scares throughout American history. After World War I, for example, after World War I, there's a growing labor movement, there's an anti-war movement, and this shakes a lot of politicians' confidence in the American government. It leads to a crackdown out of fears that all of these radical immigrants and political dissenters and these people who disagreed with the war and disagreed with capitalism would take advantage of the post-war chaos that's happening all around the world and that they would overthrow the government. This had actually occurred in Russia, right? The imperial monarchy there during World War II or during World War I is overthrown by Bolsheviks at the end of the war. Now, there are some pretty drastic differences between the situation in Russia at the end of World War I and the situation in the United States, right? Despite these differences, though, many Americans were sure that a plan was in the works for Bolsheviks in America to overthrow the government too. A. Mitchell Palmer, the US Attorney General at the time, right, kind of like the leading prosecutor of prosecutors for the government, responded by rounding up and deporting hundreds of political activists, often without trial, and arresting many thousands more. Even before World War I, labor unrest and strikes led to similar crackdowns on grassroots organizations that were willing to openly challenge the authority of government and business. Oftentimes, when we talk about Red Scares like these, people tend to focus on how fears of communism and anarchism and other kinds of less politics are stoked by politicians, right? Maybe not necessarily politicians, but they could be business people who have something to gain or popular social figures. But when you scratch the surface, you see that many of the people who fall outside of the traditional communist definition are similarly targeted in these kinds of Red Scares. That's because at their heart, oftentimes Red Scares also serve as a more general reaction to change, specifically a reaction to progressive change that upsets earlier, more entrenched social relationships and customs. We see this happening a lot, not only in American history, but in world history generally, right? Sometimes people will refer to something called reactionary politics, or they'll refer to like a pendulum swinging back. When progress pushes a society in a direction so far, you're inevitably going to have a kind of reaction, a kind of pushback against so much progressive change happening at once. We talked about how World War II was kind of a night and day situation for the United States, right? The United States going into World War II is very different from the United States coming out of World War II. And in a lot of ways, we can look at the Red Scare as a desire to kind of undo that change. We see this will happen again in the 1970s with the feminist revolution and the queer liberation movements. We'll see it happen again in the 1990s. And perhaps, you know, it's too soon to tell, but sometimes historians will look at 2016 and that election as a kind of pushback against such rapid change at the start of the new millennium. The end of World War I is another good example here, right? American politicians called for what they referred to as a return to normalcy, if you've ever heard this phrase, a return to normalcy, or more specifically, a return to the pre-war status quo. Now, America had lost over 100,000 soldiers to World War I, and the conflict seemed to do nothing but shake people's confidence in society. Modern authors after the war began questioning the legitimacy of war as a practice, and even of the authority and of the legitimacy of government. Women's political activism was on the verge of winning suffrage for white women, and flappers, kind of this label applied to the modern woman who was willing to step outside the home, cut her hair short. Flappers openly flouted traditional gender roles that consigned women to the domestic sphere, right? Consigned them to the home. At the same time, African Americans and other people of color continued to openly confront systemic racism that so much that white supremacists revived the KKK. Right? This is an organization that is reignited in the 1910s and the 1920s. It had previously died out in the 1880s after the end of the Civil War. This was done in an effort to silence anti-racist resistance. This kind of idea of reaction to change is much the same true for the second Red Scare. This isn't to say that rising Soviet power didn't provide the justification for many Americans to participate in the Red Scare, right? Post-war anxieties contributed a great deal towards people's willingness to denounce others that they knew or maybe didn't know as communists, and cheer as perceived opponents of traditional American values lost their influence and their agency. Right? You're fired, you're put in prison, something else happens, you're out of the public light. And people took joy in that. For people at the helm during the Red Scare, though, it proved to be an incredible convenience that those who could be accused of communist subversion were often also their political enemies. Or, they at least simply belonged to a group that those heading the purges didn't like or didn't agree with. So let's talk about who was targeted, right? More than just federal government employees, the HUAC subpoenaed teachers, actors, musicians, union activists, Boy Scout troop leaders, and many more came to come testify, right, in front of the committee. If someone was alleged to be a secret communist in disguise, then their best bet was usually to cooperate with the investigation. And the best way to cooperate was if you were asked to name names of others who might be involved in the communist plot, then to give them a name. So we mentioned earlier that it's not just the Reds who are being targeted, right? It's not just the communists. What makes someone a security risk? Well, red is one, right? You could be a red, a pink, someone who had personal secrets, or you could be a fellow traveler. Now, a red was a bona fide member of the Communist Party and is often the kind of person we assume that this Red Scare was targeting, right? This is the target. This is the big, bad, evil guy. But what about people who were communists or had communist beliefs, but they weren't members of a communist organization, right? A red has a membership card. Their name is on membership rolls. But what if you agree with them, if you are a communist or you are a leftist, but you're just not in an organization? Well, then you're pink. The government argued that pinks, sometimes they referred to them as pinkos or parlor pinks, the government argued they were just as threatening to national security as reds because they would be just as willing to provide America's adversaries with damning information, right? You might not be a member of the Communist Party, but you still have communist beliefs, and so we can't trust you not to pass secret government documents to the Soviet Union. You can't have this job. You can't be in this position of power. Okay, so far this purge can seem pretty reasonable, right? It overlooks the fact that communists are still Americans in this context and can be just as patriotic as Republicans or Democrats. But on face value, it seems like this is reasonable. One can believe that the communist movement is a giant monolith and as one solid, all agreeing organization is going to do things as one mind. This makes sense. But what about people who just have their own kind of secrets, their own hidden agendas, their own desires? Couldn't a communist spy find out about these secrets or maybe shameful aspects of your life and use that information to blackmail you? Then a communist wouldn't have to be hired by the federal government, right? They could just get state secrets by blackmailing others working for the federal government to give that information to them. For these reasons, you were also targeted in the Red Scare. You were also believed to be a security liability if you had a gambling problem, if you had a drinking problem, if you used drugs, if you were having an affair, if you had anything else going on in your life that was perceived by the general public to be undesirable. Because if you were hiding something undesirable, that was leverage that a communist could use to make you give them government secrets. Perhaps the largest group of quote unquote undesirable people that the government purged from its employment were gays and lesbians, also bisexual and transgender people, but those terms weren't widely used yet. This separate kind of government suppression of the LGBTQ community is sometimes referred to as the Lavender Scare, and it produces just as many, if not more, human casualties as the Red Scare does. It just tends to be something historians don't usually talk about because the group that's targeted aren't what we would refer to as normative or mainstream Americans. It's one specific community. But the Lavender Scare is also happening here. Thousands of gays and lesbians are excused from federal government under the pretense of being threats to national security. Often, there are no jobs available that made use of the technical training that federal employees undertook to land their government jobs in the first place. And so once someone was let go and their name was shared among government agencies and leading powerful companies, what might otherwise have made for a short-term job search quickly grew into periods of painful, prolonged unemployment and underemployment. Of course, couldn't necessarily turn to your family for assistance because once they found out in the 1950s why you lost your government job, more than likely you were going to be disowned. Now, these very real forms of discrimination led to similar hardships when applied on a mass scale as the Red Scare. And so we have to recognize that the Red Scare produces thousands of casualties like this. And many of the people who do become casualties of the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare, often there's a lot of overlap there, they remain unacknowledged, right? All of those names in the Washington Post that go unobserved, unanalyzed. Okay. Communists, socialists, LGBTQ people, people with gambling problems, people who are cheating on their spouses and others, they lose their livelihoods. Certainly, it's unfortunate, but in the name of national security, in the name of defeating international communism, that has to be okay, right? And that's certainly it. Well, no, actually, the largest group of individuals who are deemed security threats are the fellow travelers. And so it's worth talking about what a fellow traveler is. What is a fellow traveler? Fellow travelers were individuals who championed reforms that went against the status quo. Because they wanted to bring about progressive change in American society, officials with the FBI, the CIA, and other federal agencies argued that they would certainly cooperate with communists, not because they shared communist goals or because the communists could blackmail them into giving up information, but because the temptation to further their own objectives in exchange for selling out the government, in exchange for selling out national security, would just be too great. So who are these fellow travelers? Well, activists in the labor movement. Members of unions were seen as particularly dangerous. The American labor movement has kind of a long history of cooperation with the socialist movement and other leftists. That relationship with the communist movement, the kind of communists we see in charge of the Soviet Union, is less there. The cooperation exists, but it's not as notable, but it is there. And since both labor unions and the communist movement advocate for greater power for workers, opportunities for the middle class, and the diminished role of capitalists and corporations in politics, certainly they're going to be cooperating here, right? After World War II, major unions like the United Auto Workers, or UAW, the United Mine Workers, the Steel Workers, the Electrical Workers, a host of other unions coordinated a series of massive strikes. Now, during the war, they adhered to something called a no-strike pledge, and this was to demonstrate their patriotic commitment to the war effort. But once the war ended, companies began fighting to press wages back down to pre-war levels and strip a lot of the benefits that had been assigned to them by the federal government during wartime, right? So when Franklin Roosevelt comes out and says that Ford and Chrysler and GM and all of these other defense plants can't discriminate on the basis of race, now that the war is over, a lot of these companies want to do that. Now that the war is over, a lot of these companies want to lower wages because the labor market, there's more people who want jobs again, right? A lot of soldiers are coming home, they want jobs. Companies can now keep themselves fully staffed by paying less, and they want to lower wages. So unions respond with striking. These strikes reach critical mass in what becomes known as the Great Strike Wave of 1946 to 1947. You'll see this mentioned in chapters 1 and 2 of the These United States textbook. For members of the labor movement, the strike wave represented an organized effort to prevent a return to normalcy, where workers had no power and suffered from chronic low pay and underemployment, right? Remember the Great Depression. Is that what a return to normalcy is? The labor movement seems to think so. And to those in government and business, the strike wave on the opposite side of things was a sincere threat to America's economic security, and it needed to be defeated to make sure that the US doesn't backslide into another depression. So the labor movement says a return to normalcy is low wages. That's how we got the depression. No one could buy anything. And the government and business on the other side of things say, all of these strikes, all of these worker protests are making it so companies can't produce anything, and that's going to cause an economic problem. In 1947, particularly in response to the strike wave, Congress passes something known as the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. Sometimes it's referred to as the Labor Management Relations Act of 1947, but Taft-Hartley worked for our purposes. The act severely restricted what unions were allowed to do when negotiating for contracts. It undermined sources of union power and forced officers and unions to sign affidavits swearing they were not communists. A union would lose its protection under federal law and would ultimately be replaced by a union that would cooperate if they refused to sign these affidavits. Now, it's worth, for Truman's benefit, it is worth mentioning that he tried to veto Taft-Hartley. He and a lot of others feared that it might have too heavily restricted labor rights and put unfair limits on free speech, right? I don't agree with a communist, but if the government says that you can't be a communist, what's to say that the government will turn around tomorrow and say you can't be a Democrat? Kind of the logic behind here. And so a lot of unions pressure Truman to veto Taft-Hartley. But Congress overrides the president veto, and Taft-Hartley actually remains in effect today. It represents a huge part of why the labor movement is so weak in the United States when it's compared to other industrialized democracies. You might say, well, why did the unions sign these non-communist affidavits, right? If it was an assault on free speech, why didn't the unions stand up? Well, some of them did. The United Electrical Workers, or UE, was one of the major unions that refused to sign these Taft-Hartley affidavits. At the end of the war, they had over 500,000 members, and because they lost that federal recognition, because companies could suddenly just completely attack them so thoroughly, the UE shrank. Today, the UE is one of these unions that still exists. It's kind of an exception to the rule. Most unions that fight Taft-Hartley go under. But the UE today is very small. It has about 30,000 members in comparison to the 600,000 it had in 1946 and 1947. So a fellow traveler is a unionist. Who else is a fellow traveler? Feminists, independent women, and activists who challenge sexism could not be trusted. The Soviet Union, it was reasoned, had done away with gender distinctions and had undertaken considerable efforts to demolish the institution of the family in communist society, right? A family is bourgeois, a family is capitalist, there is only the collective. By demanding equal pay for equal work, the freedom to pursue their own careers, and to argue for a shared responsibility for housework, right? This idea that husbands would come home and help raise children just as wives did. Feminists are clearly out to destroy the American family. So with the argument, right? So even if feminists weren't inherently communists, they had to have shared goals that would make some women security threats. Now, this threat is obviously emboldened here if there are suspicions that a woman might also be a lesbian as well as a feminist. Edith Van Horn, who you see in the picture here, was a union activist and defense worker during World War II. She was a staunch supporter of gender equality initiatives, and her more radical activities within the labor movement put her on the radar of the HUAC. She was openly critical of the labor movement's cooperation with the HUAC, and because of this, Van Horn was accused of being a communist by the Detroit Free Press in 1952. If we go back to that slide about the 150 Reds named, if you were to turn onto the other side of this broadsheet, you would have seen Edith Van Horn's name. This was the newspaper she was called out in. Now, after learning of these allegations, anti-communist auto workers who worked at the same plant that Edith Van Horn did, Dodge, Maine, which is, would have been in today's Hamtramck. Communist auto workers stormed up to Van Horn's workplace, and a brief scuffle followed, where several auto workers tried to throw Van Horn out of a window. They were prevented from doing so when other predominantly Black and women workers interceded on her behalf and escorted Van Horn safely from the plant, right? She was on the third floor in something called the wire room. This is where you run cables, electric cables through the car. They tried to throw her out of a window. She's safely escorted from the plant, but Van Horn was ultimately fired by Chrysler for causing a disturbance in the workplace. She was not hired back, even after she successfully cleared her name in testimonies before the HUAC, not only in 1952 later that year, but again in 1954, and for a third time in front of the Senate in 1957. So, feminists are fellow travelers. Who else? Well, civil rights activists were similarly targeted during the Red Scare because of their desire to win progressive reforms and fight institutional racism. They came across to those in power as a threat. Even if civil rights activism wasn't seen as a threat by some, the misconception that advocates of civil rights would be more likely to work with communists led the state security apparatus to closely monitor individuals who called for racial justice and equality. In 1956, after Mississippi civil rights activist surgeon Dr. T.R.M. Howard publicly criticized the FBI for failing to properly investigate the murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till, J. Edgar Hoover, he was the head of the FBI, released a public statement condemning Howard as a communist. You can see Howard there on the right with his wife and some of his family. Howard and his family were increasingly subjected to death threats and economic pressure. And Howard was eventually forced to sell most of his property in Mississippi and move his family permanently to Chicago. The FBI also targeted Martin Luther King Jr. It's a little bit after the Red Scare ends, but it is still the worst of the Red Scare is over by the end of the 50s, but it is still kind of simmering throughout the 1960s. The FBI targeted Martin Luther King Jr. After he's awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the FBI attempted to blackmail King into not accepting the award. They told him they would inform the public of an alleged extramarital affair. They might even potentially assassinate him. After the 1963 March on Washington, Hoover had a memo circulated throughout the FBI stating that, quote, "In the light of King's powerful demagogic speech," this is of course the sons sitting together at the table of brotherhood, this powerful demagogic speech, "we must mark him now, if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future of this nation from the standpoint of communism, the standpoint of the Negro and the standpoint of national security." His powerful demagogic speech calling for brotherhood and peace. So it's pretty easy to see here how generalized terms like security risk and fellow traveler can quickly be used to expand the scope of investigations, expand the scope of harassment, and spying into something much larger and more impactful than people likely thought possible or even maybe wanted. Civil rights activists were fellow travelers. Would you be a fellow traveler in this situation? When we think about the Red Scare sometimes, that distance, it allows us to kind of detach ourselves from injustice. A lot of times people say that I would have marched with Martin Luther King. I would have stood with the feminists. I would have stood, I would have sat down in the Ford plant. You would have been a fellow traveler. Let's look at the outcomes of the Red Scare. Now, the process of naming names keeps this McCarthyist phase of the Red Scare going for years, right? Joseph McCarthy gives a speech in 1950. The Red Scare is well underway. For all intents and purposes, it starts as early as 1945, 1946. By 1950, it ratchets up things. And this process of naming names, this process of investigations, drags it out even longer. The group of targets continues to widen to actors who had espoused leftist views like Lucille Ball, radio broadcasters who just air programs that touch on themes like class disparities. Orson Welles, you see at the bottom right there, he was brought before HUAC. The accused were told that they could be removed from the blacklist and allowed to re-enter public life if they had provided names of others who were involved in the movement. Refusal to cooperate in investigations would mean remaining on blacklists, making it harder to get a job or a place to live. Cooperating with investigations might also mean having to provide false confessions, right? Even if you aren't in the communist movement, the idea that you are, the allegation that you are, still needs to be cleared. And so maybe supplying names of friends, people who you talk to on a regular basis, if that keeps you from being evicted from your home because you can't land a job, it's something that you're going to have to think about. Even if no real conspiracy existed in someone's life, they might still name names. There was a case where 10 screenwriters, all of who refused to testify before the HUAC and basically refused their subpoenas, were held in contempt of Congress. They were imprisoned, right? So a lot of times people say, well, I wouldn't go before the HUAC, right? It goes against my rights. I don't have to talk about this. I have my own private life. The Hollywood 10 thought so too, and they simply did not go before the HUAC and they were imprisoned. Also, they were blacklisted from work in the film industry. So once they got out of the industry, they didn't have a lot of career prospects. Writers who wrote on difficult themes such as African-American identity and civil rights justice, people like Langston Hughes and Richard Wright, Paul Robeson, a singer, they were all targeted. In 1954, Congress passes something known as the Communist Control Act. Officially, it outlawed the CPUSA and made having membership in the party illegal. It was a federal crime to be a communist officially. The measure passed Congress almost unanimously. And though no administration has ever tried to enforce the law, namely because there's this popular assumption that it would simply be thrown out of the books as being unconstitutional, at the time of the 1950s, that potential outcome seemed less visible. A lot of times, in times of duress and anxiety, we tend to forget a lot of the principles and a lot of the testaments on which organizations and governments and institutions are founded. Right. So a lot of times people say, well, the Communist Control Act wouldn't have been used because it's unconstitutional. I would simply ask, well, then how was it ever passed? The Communist Control Act of 1954 remains on the books as a federal law to this day. It was challenged in Nevada in the 1970s, and it was not overturned. In 1954, McCarthy went even further when he accused the United States Army of harboring communists, right? It wasn't just the State Department now, it wasn't Hollywood, it was the armed forces. He demanded hearings and trials, and this led to the Army-McCarthy hearings. The Army-McCarthy hearings were seen across the country since many American families were starting to enjoy access to personal home televisions, right? They could do things like watch the news, watch TV, more so than they had done 10 years ago. Throughout the hearings, many government officials finally came forward and broke silence to express discontent with the state of the investigations, to denounce the investigations as witch hunts. The Army-McCarthy hearings in many ways proved to be the tipping point for the Red Scare. McCarthy, in accusing the Army of communism, came across as crazed, illogical, and fanatical to many Americans. And this isn't to say, this is, to not mention unpatriotic too. In 1954, the US had just come out of the Korean War. Tens of thousands of lives had been lost. And McCarthy is calling the Army communist. In addition to coming across as unpatriotic, many Americans had grown tired of the fear of being associated with the communist movement over the perceived slightest possible reason or transgression. McCarthy soon fell out of his spotlight and in government, after being formally censured by the Senate for his conduct as a political officer, a political representative, he was left with nearly zero political clout to speak of. Now, McCarthy didn't just give up, right? He continued giving fiery speeches before Congress, but he often gave these speeches to empty rooms, his colleagues either choosing to deliberately avoid him or simply becoming absorbed in their own affairs too much to actually continue paying him mind. McCarthy died of complications relating to alcohol poisoning in 1957. Now, a lot of times we look at Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism, and we view them as synonymous with the Red Scare, right? But again, it's worth remembering that McCarthy doesn't come onto the scene until 1950, when the Red Scare is well underway. The trial of Alger Hiss, the blacklisting of the Hollywood 10, the trial of the Rosenbergs is underway at this time, but these other two things happen even before McCarthy gives this first speech in West Virginia, where he claims to have these 57 names. Far from McCarthy serving as one inflammatory demagogue acting to incite paranoia in American politics, and arguably in succeeding, but instead of looking at McCarthy this way, it might be better to look at McCarthy as just one opportunistic politician, someone who, living through a difficult period in American history, was able to provide Americans with convenient scapegoats and simple answers to problems that kept them awake at night. And in the process, he was able to further his own political ambitions and his own career, at least for a time. Regardless of how we view McCarthy and his own specific legacy, for the Red Scare in general, the post-war anxieties Americans felt, the political changes made to accommodate them, had long-lasting consequences for American history and society. Most notably, the Red Scare and McCarthyism can be said, at the very least, to have ruined the lives of thousands of innocent people. The Red Scare chilled free speech for more than a decade. It demoralized public servants and led many Americans to question their loyalties or the loyalties of the public servants that worked for them. It drove LGBTQ people deeper into the closet and hampered many other civil rights initiatives. And it substantially weakens the labor movement. The legacy of the Red Scare still very much lives with us to this day. Based on these takeaways alone, it's probably fair to say that the simple answers and scapegoats the Red Scare provided Americans with didn't make the country stronger. Contrarily, the scapegoating of the Red Scare likely prolonged many of the painful struggles America would be forced to contend with throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Like I mentioned at the start of this lecture, when we think about the Red Scare, when we talk about it, this historical distance that we tend to afford ourselves can be comfortable. This is especially true when the history we study seems to be so dark and unfortunate, but that distance can keep us from making the connections necessary to avoid repeating the Red Scare in the future, or today, too. Food for thought. It might be worth asking, how do we avoid another Red Scare in the future? How do we avoid repeating the mistakes that we've made in the past? If these kinds of topics are particularly interesting to you, then you'll be pleased to know that they form the central focus of one of our discussion board prompts that you'll have to respond to by the end of the week. Again, there's usually 4 to 5 of these. This week there will be 4. And for this lecture, I'm going to ask how do we avoid a repeat of the Red Scare? How do we make sure that we don't get carried away in times of stress and take actions that can be harmful to our country, our fellow citizens, and other human beings? This is just one of these responses, though. By the end of the week, make sure that out of these 4 available prompts, you do make responses to 2 of them. That's that 300-word kind of well thought out, your thoughts on a subject response. But also make sure you're responding to 2 of your classmates, right? A couple sentences in response to, replying to one of these responses. Make sure you're staying up on that online participation. Also, make sure you're staying up to date on your readings. By the end of the week, try and have chapter 1 of These United States completed, but also part 2 of whichever biography you've chosen to read for our midterm book review, right? Asada, an autobiography, or Kovic's Born on the 4th of July. Those book reviews are going to be due by the end of week 4, so it'll really help if you're staying on top of this reading. If you're not a fan of reading, keep in mind that those audio options are available for you too. And of course, again, if you've already watched the Who Started the Cold War lecture, a lot of this is going to be familiar, but just to reiterate, we do have our first extra credit film review due by the end of the day, Friday. That is optional. You don't have to do it. But if you want to start picking up some extra points, just in case, to give yourself a little bit of a grade cushion there, bump up your grade a little bit, that first one will be due. Why We Fight, War Comes to America. It's a documentary about the origins of World War II. It was published and released in 1945. So go ahead and write a response to that, right? What do you think about it? What do you think people at the time thought about it? How does it differ from our understanding today? Any kind of general response is well appreciated. And lastly, of course, again, as always, if you have any sorts of questions, any concerns, if you need to clarify anything with me or just need to talk about class in general, feel free to send me a message on Canvas. That'll send a push notification to my phone. I'll probably be more quick to respond to that, but you can also always reach me by email too. So don't hesitate to reach out. As your instructor, I'm always available to assist you in any way I can.